Snow fell on Coventry the night Judith Vavasor spent her last copper coin on a dying stranger. She had counted that coin twice before leaving the modiste shop. Bread for Leo, whose cough would not quit. Syrup for Phyllis, who had stopped asking. One coin, one choice. She chose bread, and she walked home through the alley behind St. Michael's because the wind was gentler there. He was slumped against the stone, a knife still buried in his flank. A tall man in a bloodied cravat, jaw hard as flint, eyes the pale blue of river ice. He gave one name, Arthur, a mercenary, he said, without work or family. She gave hers, Judith. Then she pressed her copper coin into the apothecary's palm for bandages and brandy, and she knelt in the snow until the bleeding stopped. She did not know his true name. She did not know that the ducal contract hidden beneath the floorboards of her garret bore the same signature as the man now breathing under her hands. She did not know that the Duke of Oversley, the cold monster she had been sold to at a distance, was watching her save his life by candlelight. What she did next, without knowing any of it, is why he came back. Before the story begins, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of justice, dignity, and love that arrives against all odds move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. Coventry, January of 1815, and the sleet came sideways through the broken slate above the Vavasor attic, striking the tin basin Judith had set on the floorboards 3 winters earlier, and never moved. The basin rang once, twice, a small dull bell keeping time with the wind. She did not look up. Her needle rose and fell through the shoulder of a fawn-colored gown she had already mended twice this season, and the thread she used tonight was the wrong shade because the right shade cost a farthing she did not have. The candle by her elbow was down to a stub the length of her thumbnail. She had been trimming its wick every quarter hour to make it last until the letter was read aloud and the children asleep. Phyllis knelt on the bare boards at her feet, 10 years old and thin as a reed, the paper trembling between her hands more from the cold than from any feeling in the words. She had begun to read the letter 3 times already, and each time Leo had coughed and made her lose her place. Now she began again, in the careful, slightly sing-song cadence a governess had drilled into her before the governess had been dismissed for want of wages. My dearest daughters, and my dear little son, if God permits this letter to reach you before the packet, know that I have arranged what a father, in his last extremity, could arrange. There is a contract, my Judith. It is in the tin. Guard it as you guard your sister and your brother, and remember that a Vavasor keeps her word even when the world does not keep its word to her. Phyllis lowered the paper, her eyes lifted to Judith's face for permission to stop. Read on, Judith said, very quietly. I have written also to the gentleman in question. He is a great man, and a hard one, they say, but he is a man of honor, which in this century is a rarer thing than a great one. Trust him, and trust nothing else. Leo coughed. It was a small cough, dry at the top and wet at the bottom, and it moved through the low room like something with paws. Judith set the needle down against the fabric of the gown, held it there with one finger so it should not fall between the boards, and put her free hand on the crown of his head. His hair was warm. Everything else about him was cold. Enough for tonight, she said. Phyllis folded the letter along its old creases with the pained neatness of a child who has been told once, and only once, that paper was expensive. She held it out. Judith took it, kissed the fold, and slid it inside the front of her stays where the pasteboard had gone soft with sweat. Come, she said. Bed. There was one bed and one mattress of straw, and one blanket that had been a curtain in the drawing room at Vavasor Grange before the Grange was sold. She laid Phyllis on the wall side and Leo in the middle, and she took the outside, which was the cold side, and she pulled the blanket over the 3 of them, and waited for the small furnace of their 2 bodies to warm her own. Leo coughed again. Judith counted. 60 seconds, then another cough, 90, then quiet. When their breathing had lengthened and Phyllis's arm had gone loose across her brother's chest, Judith slid from beneath the blanket. She did it in the way she had trained herself to do it, one limb at a time, the mattress giving up her weight by degrees so that neither child stirred. She knelt by the 3rd board from the wall. The board was loose because she had loosened it, patiently, with the point of a broken knitting needle, one November afternoon a year ago, when she had first understood that a house may be searched by men with a warrant, and that a woman's honor, in law, resides in what she can produce and not in what she has been. She lifted the board now. Beneath it lay a tin the size of a prayer book, and beside the tin lay a single copper penny worn thin at the king's cheek. She lifted the lid of the tin. The ducal contract was folded in quarters. The wax seal of Oversley cracked once across the impressed crest, but still legible. She did not unfold it. She had read it enough times to recite the clauses that concerned her by memory, and in particular, the clause that troubled her most, which was the one that spoke of what should be done with her person in the event that the party of the first part should be, in the language of the drafting solicitor, indisposed or absent from the realm. Beneath the contract was a small square of tissue, and beneath the tissue, in a nest of the tissue, was her mother's wedding ring. It was plain gold. She had not sold it because she believed, without argument, that the day she sold it would be the day her mother's protection lifted from the three of them entirely, and she preferred to be cold and hungry with that protection than warm and fed without it. She replaced the lid. She placed the copper penny beside the tin. She looked at the penny for a long moment. Then she took it, closed her hand around it, put the board back, pressed it down with the heel of her palm until the nails caught, and rose. Somewhere below in the street, a man's voice went up. Vavasour. Judith did not startle. Her body had learned, over the course of the autumn, not to give the creditors that satisfaction. She crossed to the dormer, drew the sacking curtain aside by half an inch, and looked down into the narrow slot of cross-cheaping. 3 men, 2 she knew. The tallow chandler, whose bill for the winter's candles she had reduced by $1 last month, by taking in his wife's linen at the modiste's for nothing, and who nevertheless had come. The butcher's boy, sent by the butcher, who had a kinder face than his errand, and a third man, a stranger in a plain black coat with a leather satchel, who she took to be a clerk from the sheriff's office, and whose presence she had been expecting since Michaelmas. "Miss Vavasour," the tallow chandler called up, more from habit than hope, for he knew as well as she did that no candle burned at that hour in her window. "We shall come again in the morning, miss. We shall come again in the morning and every morning until this account is settled." She let the sacking fall. She did not move at once. She stood in the dark with her hand on the copper penny in her palm, and she did the arithmetic she had done every night for the past 4 weeks. A twist of bread from the baker in Bishop Street cost 3 farthings. A phial of the paregoric that quieted Leo's cough for 3 hours cost 1.5 pence. She could have one, and she could not have both. If she bought the bread, Leo would cough until dawn, and Phyllis would not sleep, and Judith would go to Mrs. Pennington's shop, with the tremor in her right hand that had lately begun to spoil her stitches. If she bought the syrup, the 3 of them would eat nothing until the wage on Saturday, which was 4 days off, and Leo, whose cheekbones were already visible under the skin, would grow visible in other places too. She closed her hand on the penny. Tomorrow she would decide. Tonight she would put the penny in the pocket she had sewn inside her stays, next to the letter, and she would sleep 2 hours, and she would rise at 5 and be at the modiste's by 6, and by 6 1/4 she would have laid a fire in Mrs. Pennington's grate without being asked, because Mrs. Pennington was 52 and her hands ached in this weather, and a kindness done before it was noticed was, in Judith's experience, the only currency the poor could still spend without diminishing themselves. She lay down again beside the children. Leo had rolled toward her in her absence. She fitted her body to the curve of his back, and she did not sleep. Morning came the color of pewter. Judith rose before the bells at St. Michael's had finished the hour. She washed her face in the tin basin, which had 2 inches of gray water in it and a rime of ice at the edge. She braided her hair in the dark by feel, twisted it into the coque at her nape, and pinned it with the 2 horn pins she owned. She put on the fawn gown she had mended the night before. She tied the dark woolen shawl across her breast in the crossed fashion of a countrywoman, because a shawl tied so freed both hands for work, and because the crossing hid the shoulder where the wrong-colored thread showed. She woke Phyllis last. "You will keep the fire in until I return at 7, she said. "You will not open the door to any voice you do not know, and you will not open it to any voice you do know either, unless it is Mrs. Pennington's boy, and he will say the word marigold, and if he does not say it, he is not from her. You will give Leo the last of the barley in the small pot, and you will drink the water it was cooked in yourself, and you will not tell me later that you did not." Phyllis nodded. She had heard the speech in some form for the last 120 mornings. She had never once opened the door. Judith kissed the crown of her head, and then Leo's, and she went out. The stair down from the attic was steep, and it turned twice, and on the second turn the wood had rotted in the corner, and she had to place her foot on the outer edge of the tread. Below her, the boarding house was already awake with the small, unpleasant noises of a house too full. A man was shouting at his wife on the first floor. A baby was crying on the ground floor. Someone in the passage had emptied a basin into the yard through the wrong window, and the smell of it hung in the cold like a rebuke. She stepped into the street. The sleet had turned, in the small hours, to a thin, driving snow. Cross-Cheaping was already streaked with wheel tracks and the black slush of a market town at dawn. She turned left, toward the modistes, and she had gone perhaps 10 paces when a voice behind her lifted her name into the raw air. Vavasour. She did not turn. Miss Vavasour, I am not to be avoided, miss. She turned then. She turned slowly, because to turn slowly was to insist that she had chosen to turn, and she looked back along the ruts to where the tallow chandler had come out of a doorway with his account book open in his gloved hand. She dropped him half a curtsy. It was a very slight curtsy, no lower than a gentleman's daughter owed to a tradesman she could not pay, and it lasted a beat longer than politeness would have asked, because she wanted him to see, in the length of it, that a Vavasour still knew how to bend her knee. Mr. Weatherby, she said, I have not forgotten you. No, miss, I did not think you had. On Saturday next, she said, I shall bring you a shilling on account. He looked at her. He was not an unkind man. He had a wife of his own and 3 daughters, and he had, in October, given her a pair of dips out of his own pocket without ringing them into the book. But he had a ledger that another man would inspect at Lady Day, and a shilling was a shilling. A shilling would do, miss, he said. Against the guinea and 4. Against the guinea and 4. He inclined his head. He did not smile. He stepped back into his doorway, and she walked on, and neither of them acknowledged that she had lied, because she had not yet lied. On Saturday she would find the shilling. She did not yet know how, but she had found shillings before, out of air only slightly less thin than this. She crossed the market. 2 women at the pump watched her go without speaking. She had once been Miss Vavasour of Vavasour Grange, and one of the women had, in another century, curtsied to her at a village fair. They did not curtsy now. They watched her the way one watches a cautionary tale walk past, and Judith let them, because the alternative was to feel it, and she could not afford to feel it, and also to work a full day at the counter. Mrs. Pennington's shop stood at the corner of Bailey Lane and Little Park Street. Above the door a painted sign that read, in a careful copperplate, H. Pennington, Modiste, and below that, in smaller letters, established 1789. The window was already lit. The old woman herself, small and round in her bombazine with the jet at her throat catching the lamp, was standing on a wooden step and pinning up a length of Pomona green sarcenet for the day's display. She turned when the bell went. You are early, she said. The fire wanted laying, ma'am. The fire, said Mrs. Pennington, was laid an hour since by me, because I could not sleep for the ache in my hands. Take off that shawl before you drip on the sarcenet, child, and put the kettle on. And drink a cup of tea before you touch a needle. I will not have you fainting into Lady Barnard Spencer this afternoon. Judith set down her basket. She untied the shawl. She hung it on the peg by the back door where the wet would not touch the goods, and she put the kettle over the small, clean fire, and only when she turned back into the light of the front room did Mrs. Pennington see her face. The old modiste looked at her a moment. She stepped down from the wooden step. She crossed to Judith and, without ceremony, laid the flat of her hand against Judith's cheek. How is the child? He coughed twice in the night, ma'am. Only twice. Only twice, Mrs. Pennington repeated. She did not believe it. Judith did not require her to believe it. Mrs. Pennington took her hand away. There is a wedge of yesterday's pie in the cupboard behind the pattern books. You will eat it before you sit down. That is not a kindness, Vavasour. That is an order from your employer, and if you disobey it, I shall dock you 6 pence. Yes, ma'am. And after you have eaten it, you will take a message for me to the linen draper in Hertford Street, and you will bring back 3 yards of the white jaconet he has been keeping for me since Monday, and you will not, on your way, be tempted to buy anything for yourself with the penny in your pocket, because I saw you touch your bodice twice on the way in, and I know what a woman does when she has 1 coin left and children at home. Judith looked at her. She did not answer at once. The kettle behind her began, in a small gathering way, to sing. "I have never yet spent it, ma'am," she said. "No," said Mrs. Pennington. "That is what frightens me." She turned back to the sarcenet, and she said nothing more, and Judith took the wedge of pie from behind the pattern books, and she ate it standing at the back counter, in 6 neat bites, and she felt, for the first time since the letter had been read the night before, the small hot bloom of food in her stomach. She would not spend the penny today, she had decided. She would carry it in the pocket at her breast, next to the folded contract of a duke she had never seen, and she would carry it home again at 7, and she would put it back beneath the 3rd board from the wall, and tomorrow she would decide again. It was not much of a decision. It was, she thought, tying the strings of Mrs. Pennington's fresh apron behind her back, the only kind of decision she had left. And a Vavasour, her father had written from Portugal in the last letter of his life, was a woman who made the decision that was in front of her, and made it well, and did not ask the world to hand her a different one. She took up her basket. She lifted the latch. She stepped out again into the snow. She did not yet know that by nightfall, in a black alley behind St. Michael's, she would have spent the penny on a stranger, and the stranger would say a name that was not his name, and everything her father had built with his signature on a piece of vellum in a Lisbon inn would begin, for good or for ill, to move. The snow came sideways through Coventry that evening, thin as needles and mean as gossip, and Judith Vavasour turned into the alley behind St. Michael's with her head down and the last of Mrs. Pennington's ribbons wound tight against her ribs beneath the fawn wool. The bell of the cathedral had already struck 6. She had stayed an hour past her wage to finish the beading on a bombazine morning gown for a merchant's wife in Warwick, and Mrs. Pennington had pressed a small parcel of cold mutton pie into her hands at the door, with an apology dressed as a benediction. The penny still lay in her pocket. She had counted it 3 times on the way, thumb worrying the milled edge through the wool of her glove. Bread. Syrup for Leo. Not both. Bread lasted. Syrup did not. Syrup silenced the cough. Bread did not. She walked, and she calculated. At first she thought the shape by the wall was a heap of sacking someone had thrown out from the corn chandler's yard. Then the heap moved. A long leg unfolded a fraction into the trampled slush. A hand, ungloved, opened and closed against the cobbles as though testing whether cobbles were still there. She stepped nearer. The lantern above the postern of St. Michael's threw a thin yellow onto the snow, and she saw a man lying half on his side against the flint wall, a dark greatcoat rucked up beneath him, one boot gone at the heel. Below his ribs on the left, the wool of his coat was black where black had no business being. A knife stood in him to the hilt, plain and short and workmanlike, set slightly upward under the last rib. Judith did not scream. Scream was a luxury of women who had someone to come running. She knelt. The snow bit through her petticoat at once, and she did not feel it. She set the parcel of mutton pie down at his hip and pulled off one furred-through glove with her teeth and laid the back of her fingers against his cheek. Cold, but not the cold of a dead man. His breath moved, shallow, patient, as though he had already decided that panic would kill him faster than the knife. His eyes opened. They were pale, pale as the inside of a green bottle held to a lamp, pale as river ice in February. They found her, focused, considered her, with an attention that struck her as improper for a man with steel in him. "Do not pull it out," he said. His voice was low and educated and not from Coventry. "I had not intended to," Judith answered. Her own voice surprised her by being steady. "I am not a fool. I did not suppose you were." She sat back on her heels. The alley was empty. The bells for evening service had emptied it. Whoever had put the knife in him had gone, and had gone believing the job finished. She looked at the mouth of the alley, a drift of ash-gray dusk. A single figure passed on the far pavement without turning his head. Coventry was very good at not turning its head. "Can you stand?" she asked. "Presently." Presently is not an answer. A ghost of something moved at the corner of his mouth. Presently is the only answer a gentleman with a knife in him is entitled to. She almost smiled. She caught herself. She tightened the shawl at her throat and began, methodically, to think. The apothecary at the top of Bailey Lane would not open his door after 7 for anything less than a magistrate. The surgeon in Little Park Street took 3 shillings before he would lift a lamp. Mrs. Pennington's rooms were half a mile the wrong way, and Phyllis and Leo were alone in the garret with the last 2 lumps of coal and no supper past the crust she had left them at dawn. The penny. She drew it from her pocket. The king's dulled profile stared up at her, worn nearly featureless by other people's calculations. She held it for 1 breath. 2. Wait, she said, though he had shown no intention of leaving. She rose. She crossed the alley to the postern door of St. Michael's and struck it hard with the flat of her palm. 3 quick blows. The verger's boy, 13 and lazy and known to her, cracked it open. "Cyril," she said, "there is a hurt man in the alley. I need clean linen, an old surplice will do, and I need you to fetch Widow Cadby from the yard behind the Golden Cross, and tell her Judith Vavasor will pay her a penny for a pint of her strongest and a mug of her Sunday broth, and she is to send them by you, and no talk of it in the tap room. Say the penny is in my hand." The boy blinked. Then he saw her face. He went. She returned to the man against the wall. She unwound her shawl and laid it under his shoulder, to lift him a finger's breadth from the wet stone. She unbuttoned the front of the greatcoat with the same steady fingers she used on a bombazine seam. Beneath it a plain waistcoat, plain shirt, and blood as thick and dark as treacle. She did not touch the knife. She cut away the linen around it with the small scissors Mrs. Pennington had once given her for Christmas, and had never quite been able to ask back. "You have done this before," the stranger said. "My father was a soldier," she said. "He came home once from Corunna with a ball in his thigh. I was 15. There was no surgeon. There was only me." "Corunna?" "Yes." He was silent then, and she was too occupied to notice the quality of his silence. Cyril came back with an old surplice folded under his arm, and a heavy stoneware jug, and a covered pannikin, and behind him, quicker than Judith had dared hope, came Widow Cadby herself with a lantern and a shut mouth. The widow set the lantern on a barrel head, took 1 look at the man on the ground, took 1 look at Judith, and asked no questions at all. She had buried 2 husbands and a son of the peninsula, and questions had never brought any of them back. "Penny first," she said. Judith put the penny into the woman's palm. The penny went into the woman's apron. That was that. They worked together. The widow held the lantern low. Judith tore the surplice into strips with her teeth where the linen resisted. She soaked 1 strip in the spirit from the jug, Widow Cadby's own, distilled behind the Golden Cross and stronger than any surgeon's, and set it aside. She drew a long breath. "I am going to draw it out," she told the stranger. "It has not gone deep. It has caught in the muscle above the hip. If it had gone where it was meant to go, we would not be speaking. Do you understand me?" "I understand you. Bite on this." She folded a wad of linen and set it between his teeth. He closed his teeth on it without protest. She set her left hand flat against his ribs to steady the flesh. With her right, she took the hilt. She waited 1 heartbeat, because her father had taught her that a heartbeat of stillness was worth 2 of hurry, and then she drew the blade out clean along its own line. He made no sound. His pale eyes did not close. A muscle moved once in his jaw. The blood came, dark and steady, not the bright arterial leap that would have ended it. Judith pressed the spirit-soaked linen into the wound with the heel of her hand and leaned her weight upon it, and counted silently to 60. Widow Cadby held the lantern and murmured a psalm under her breath. Not devoutly, but as a woman counts stitches. At 60, Judith lifted the linen a finger's breadth. The bleeding had slowed. She packed the wound with a fresh pad, wrapped a long strip twice about his waist, knotted it tight against the small of his back, where his own weight would help hold it, and sat back on her heels. "You will live," she said, "if you do not walk far tonight, and if the fever does not come. You are certain of both?" "I am certain of neither. I am certain only that you will live tonight." He let the wad of linen fall from his teeth. Widow Cadby lifted the pannikin. Judith took it and held it to his mouth, and he drank the broth slowly, 3 swallows, 4, and stopped. "Enough," he said. "Give the rest to the boy." Cyril received the pannikin with round eyes. Judith wiped her hands on the ruined shawl. Her hands shook now that they were no longer required to be steady. She hid them in her lap and looked at the stranger properly for the first time. He was tall even lying down. His boots reached almost to the far side of the alley. His hair was dark and cut short as a soldier's, and there was a thread of gray at the left temple that did not match the youth of his jaw. A close-trimmed beard, dark. A face made all of angles, the kind of face that would look severe in prosperity and now, in blood and dirt, looked simply used. A long white scar ran from the point of his left cheekbone into the beard. His left leg lay at an angle she recognized. An old wound, not this one. He had come into this alley already limping. "Your name," she said. He considered her a moment before he answered, and she saw the consideration without knowing what to make of it. "Arthur?" he said. "Arthur what?" "Arthur Noel. A soldier. Discharged." "Discharged from where?" "From service that is finished." She let it pass. Discharged men had reasons. Half of Coventry had reasons. "Judith," she said. "Judith Vavasour." He did not flinch at the name. She noted, without knowing she noted it, that his lids lowered a fraction, the smallest closing of a shutter behind those pale eyes, and then opened again, as though the shutter had never moved. "Miss Vavasour," he said. "Mr. Noel." Widow Cadby stood up with a grunt and gathered her lantern. "He cannot lie in this alley," she said. "He'll be dead by matins of the cold if the knife hasn't finished him." "No," Judith agreed. "My rooms are full," said the widow, "and my husband's brother is in the second bed with the pleurisy, and I've no charity to spare, God forgive me." "You have given enough," Judith said. She looked at the man. "Can you walk 200 yards? With help? Cyril, run ahead to Palmer Lane, number 11, top garret. Tell Phyllis to bank the fire and bar the door until I knock 3 and 2. Say her sister brings a hurt man and there is nothing to fear. Say it plainly, do not embellish." The boy went. He was learning quickly. Judith set her shoulder under the stranger's right arm. Widow Cadby set her considerable weight under his left. Together, with a slowness that was almost ceremonious, they raised him. He swayed, he steadied, his breath hissed once between his teeth and then flattened again. They walked. The snow had thickened. Palmer Lane was 2 turnings and a courtyard. They passed no one. Coventry, on the eve of a hard frost, kept behind its shutters. Once a dog barked at them from a chained kennel, and once a woman's laugh came from an upstairs window, and neither noticed them, and Judith found that she was grateful, in a way she could not have named, for the town's magnificent indifference. At the foot of number 11 she loosed him against the doorpost and knocked her signal. 3, then 2, and Phyllis's small solemn face appeared in the crack above the chain. "Oh, Judy," she whispered. "Bar the street door behind us and go up first." They climbed. 4 flights. He climbed on his own leg when he could and on Judith's shoulder when he could not, and at the second landing Widow Cadby, panting, kissed Judith's forehead like a benediction and turned back down the stairs into the snow, refusing thanks with a lifted hand. At the top, Phyllis had already dragged the straw pallet out from under the eaves and laid it before the little grate, and Leo, wrapped in his blanket, sat up on the box bed with round, wet eyes and did not cry, because Judith had once told him that a Vavasour did not cry in front of a stranger, and Leo took his sister's rules as scripture. They laid Arthur Noel on the pallet. Judith unpinned his greatcoat and drew it over him. She fed the fire the last of the good coal and a knot of the pine kindling she had been saving for Sunday. She heated water in the tin kettle. She washed the blood from her hands in the basin and did not look at the water afterwards. Phyllis crept close. "Judy," she whispered, "is he a bad man?" Judith looked at the face on the pallet. The pale eyes were closed now. In sleep, the angles of him softened not at all. If anything, the face grew sterner, as if severity were his resting state, and civility his effort. "I do not know," she said honestly, "but he was not a bad man tonight. Where will we sleep?" "You and Leo, in the box bed. I shall sit up." "With him?" "With him." Phyllis considered this with the gravity of a privy councillor, and then patted back to Leo. Within a quarter of an hour, both children were asleep, breath rising and falling in the small, ragged music that was, for Judith, the sound of the world being still worth its trouble. She drew the 3-legged stool close to the pallet and sat. The fire settled. The wind pried at the shutter and gave up. Somewhere in the town a clock struck 10. She watched Arthur Noel's chest lift and fall beneath the greatcoat and counted his breaths against her own, and once, when they slowed too far, she leaned forward and set her palm on his forehead, and the pale eyes opened at once, unfevered, as if he had merely been resting behind the lids and waiting for her hand. "You should sleep," he said. "Presently." The ghost at the corner of his mouth returned. He did not fight it this time. "Miss Vavasour," he said, "why did you stop?" She had expected many questions. This one caught her. "Because you were there. Others were there. Others passed. I heard them. I had a penny." "That is not an answer." She was silent a long moment. The fire made a small collapse and threw up a red glow across her face, and she did not know how tired she looked in that light, or how young. "My father died last April," she said at last, quietly, so as not to wake the children. "He was a soldier. He was a good man and a foolish one, and he left us less than nothing, and he made a contract with a great man in Lisbon in the year 8, at the time of Corunna, when both of them believed they might be dead by Michaelmas. It was a contract about me. I was 7. It was foolish. It was also, my father believed, honorable, and honor, in my house, is not a thing one negotiates." She looked down at her hands. They were cracked at the knuckles from the cold. "The great man is a duke. He has taken to himself the debts my father left. He has bought back the house and the acres. He has done, on paper, everything a gentleman is required to do. Next month he will send a carriage for me. I have never seen him. I have heard, in Coventry, that he hangs poachers on his own oaks, and that his eyes are the color of pond ice, and that he has not smiled since Corunna." She lifted her chin. "I have a sister of 10 and a brother of 7, and no other means of keeping them. I will honor the contract, because my father signed it, and because Phyllis eats and Leo eats. But tonight I had a penny, Mr. Noel, and I thought of my father lying in an alley in Portugal 7 years ago, with a French ball in his thigh, and I thought that if any Englishwoman with a penny had passed him and walked on, then he would not have come home to make his foolish contract at all, and I should not exist to keep it. So I stopped." She did not look at him as she spoke. She was speaking, in truth, more to the fire than to the stranger. When she looked up, at last, the pale eyes had not left her face. He said nothing for a very long time. What he did not say, what he could not yet say, was that 7 years ago in Lisbon, in a smoke-brown inn a stone's throw from the Tagus, a young officer newly succeeded to a dukedom he had not wanted, had put his signature beneath the signature of a Captain Vavasour, and had done so half in jest and half in a grief he had never named, because Captain Vavasour had that same afternoon carried him 3 miles on his back out of the retreat from Corunna, and had asked, as payment, only that a great man remember a small girl in Warwickshire. The Duke of Oversley had remembered. He remembered now. He closed his eyes because if he did not close them she would read his face, and it was not yet time for her to read his face. "Miss Vavasour," he said, and his voice, when it came, was rougher than the wound in his side accounted for. "I shall not forget this." "You will," she said gently. "Men do. Not this one." She rose to feed the fire another sliver of pine. When she sat again, the stool was a little closer to the pallet, and neither of them remarked upon it. Outside the wind rose and fell and rose again, and the snow went on burying Coventry inch by patient inch. And in a garret at the top of Palmer Lane, a woman in a fawn wool dress remended 3 times at the shoulder, sat up all night beside a duke she did not know she had saved, and counted his breathing against the small ragged breathing of her sister and her brother, and did not know, and could not have guessed, that the penny already spent had begun to purchase something no ledger in England was yet prepared to price. He was gone before the bells of St. Michael struck 7. Judith found the pallet empty, the blanket folded with the precision of a soldier, and a single line of dried blood on the deal boards where he had stood to pull on his boots. She stared at the blanket a long moment. Then she washed the blood off her knuckles at the basin, tied her bonnet, and went out into the pale iron morning as if nothing at all had happened in the night. The wind on Palmer Lane cut sideways. She lowered her head, tucked the bundle of unfinished shirts against her ribs, and set off toward Mrs. Pennington's shop. At the corner of Hertford Street, a shadow lengthened beside her and matched her step, and a gloved hand slipped the bundle from under her arm before she could resist. "You will drop it in the slush, Miss Vavasour," said Arthur, "and Mrs. Pennington will take the price out of your wages." She stopped. He stopped. He wore a plain, drab greatcoat she had never seen before, the collar turned up, the cravat clean, the stubble along his jaw shaven close around the small dark bruise on his cheekbone. He carried her bundle of linen under his own arm, as if it had always belonged there. "You should be in bed," she said. "I have been in bed. It bored me. You were bleeding 4 hours ago. I bleed frequently. It is a habit of mine to survive it. She looked at him. His eyes in daylight were paler than she had prepared herself for, a color she had only ever seen in the sky above Coventry in the last minute before a hailstorm. She began to walk again, because standing was worse. He walked beside her, slower than his own stride would have carried him, so that she did not have to hurry. His limp was a fraction more pronounced than it had been in the garret. She understood, without being told, that he had chosen not to hide it from her. "Where do you lodge?" she asked, keeping her eyes on the puddles. "Number 9, at the back of the yard. Mrs. Craik lets a room above her stable." "That is 4 doors from mine." "Yes. Yesterday you had nowhere. Yesterday I had a knife in my side. Circumstances alter." She did not answer. She did not know how to say that the space between number 9 and her own attic felt at once too narrow and too wide. She only walked, and he walked with her, and at the door of Mrs. Pennington's shop he handed back the bundle and touched the brim of his hat, and turned away without asking a single question of the sort a man usually asks a woman he has spent the night beneath. Inside, Mrs. Pennington peered over her half-moon spectacles. "Miss Vavasour, your rent is paid." Judith's hand closed hard on the bundle. "Paid?" "Through the quarter. A gentleman came in at 6:30. He gave the name of Mr. Arthur Noel. He laid 3 sovereigns on this counter and said the money was owed to your late father for a debt of honor incurred in the peninsula. He asked that you not be told. I have decided you should be." Judith felt the counter under her palm and did not remember placing it there. "Why tell me?" "Because I am 52 years old, and I know the difference between a man discharging a debt and a man laying claim. That was the first kind, but I will not have you deceived under my own roof." Judith set the bundle down with a slow, careful hand. "I did not ask him to do this." "Of course you did not. He would think less of you if you had." She went into the back room and unpicked 6 seams she had already sewn straight, because her hands needed something to punish. Through the wall she could hear the small bell over the door ring and ring again, as customers came and went in the January cold, and behind each ring her mind put the same picture, a wounded man on the floor of her garret whispering a false name, and a stranger at a counter at 6:30, laying down 3 sovereigns for a debt no ledger contained. By noon she had decided what she would do. By 12:30 she had unmade the decision. By 1 o'clock she had made it again. She would refuse the money. She would tell him in the plainest words that a woman in her position could not accept such a thing from a mercenary of unknown fortune without ruin, and that if he wished to help her, he might do so by keeping 4 doors' distance and never speaking her name in a public street. She rehearsed the speech, sitting very straight over the linen, until every word of it fitted. At 6 o'clock, she stepped into Palmer Lane, and he was waiting at the corner with the collar of his coat turned up, and he took the bundle from her without a word, and she said nothing of the speech at all. They walked. The snow had thinned into a slow, sifting powder. A costermonger's boy pushed past with a barrow of frozen turnips, and Arthur put out a hand and steadied her at the elbow so briefly that if she had blinked she would have missed it. "Mr. Noel," she said. "Miss Vavasour, you paid my rent. I discharged a debt. My father owed you nothing. Your father commanded a company at Vimero that saved the life of a man I served under. It is a distant enough connection that no lady need feel it in her pride, and near enough that I do not feel it in mine." She let the lie stand in the cold air between them. She could feel him watching the side of her face and refusing to be pleased with his own invention. "If ever such a debt existed," she said, "it would have been to my father, not to me, not to my children. Your father is dead, Miss Vavasour. His creditors are not so scrupulous about the distinction. I saw no reason to be. You do not know me. I know that you spent a copper penny on aqua vitae and clean linen for a man you had never seen, when the same penny would have bought your brother a spoonful of syrup. If I knew nothing else of you, that would be sufficient." She stopped in the mouth of the alley behind St. Michael's, in exactly the place where she had first seen him bleeding into the snow. He stopped a pace beyond her and turned. In the failing light his face was gaunter than it had been in her garret, and it came to her, with a small cold clarity, that he had not eaten that day. "You will come up," she said. "There is broth. It is thin. You will have some. Miss Vavasour, you will have some. Mr. Noel, or you will make me a liar to my own generosity, and I will not forgive you for it." He inclined his head. The barest smile touched the corner of his mouth and vanished. That was the first evening. There followed a week, and then another, and then a third, and Coventry did not know what to make of it, and so, in the way of small cities, decided to make nothing at all. Every morning Arthur was at the corner of Hertford Street with his collar up. Every morning he took the bundle of linen from under her arm and walked her to Mrs. Pennington's door, and set the bundle in her hands, and touched his hat, and turned back down the lane. Every evening at 6 he was there again, and Phyllis learned to watch for him from the garret window, and Leo learned to save his loudest cough for the moment the boots came up the stairs, because the man who called himself Arthur Noel would always kneel then and put a broad, warm palm on the boy's narrow chest and say, in a voice pitched low for the child alone, "Breathe with me, little sir. In, out, slower, there." He brought coal in a small sack over his shoulder, twice a week, and dropped it by the hearth as though he had merely happened past a coal merchant. He brought oranges once, in blue paper, and would not say where. Phyllis ate one section at a time and cried without knowing why. He did not touch her. Not once. Not the brush of a knuckle at a door frame. Not the glancing pressure of a hand at the small of her back on an icy crossing. It became, by the 4th week, a thing she noticed in her sleep. He asked no questions. She noticed that also. Any man in Coventry would by now have asked the name of her guardian, the amount of her portion, the condition of the entail, the identity of the writer of the letter she kept in the box beneath the floor. Arthur asked none of it. He asked instead whether Leo's cough was worse in the small hours or on waking, and whether Mrs. Pennington paid her by the piece or by the week, and whether she preferred her tea with a scrape of nutmeg or without, and each of these questions he asked once and remembered the answer forever. The letter beneath the floor she did not mention. The contract sealed in green wax that bound her, at her father's dying hand, to a duke she had never seen. That also she did not mention. Twice she almost did. Twice the name Oversley stopped in her throat with the taste of iron, and she swallowed it back down, and Arthur, watching, said nothing. What she did not see was what he did in the hours she was not there. At 8:30 each morning, after leaving her at the shop, he went to the Golden Cross in Broadgate, took a private parlor, and there received a small, precise, grey-whiskered gentleman in a long black coat who carried a brown leather case and who bowed with the exact economy of a man who had bowed to the same person 1,000 times before. "Selwyn." "Your Grace." "None of that here." "Mr. Noel." "Forgive me." Reginald poured coffee for the solicitor himself, because there was no servant in the room, and because the small courtesy pleased him. Selwyn set his case on the deal table, unclasped it, and drew out 3 folded sheets tied with red tape. "The ambush in Palmer Lane," he said. "Yes. It was not opportunistic. I did not think it was." "Continue." Selwyn adjusted his small round spectacles. "The 2 men taken up by the watch on the Warwick Road have been persuaded to speak. Both were paid in advance, in silver, from a purse of Spanish coin. Both received their instructions in the yard of the Rose and Crown at Kenilworth from a gentleman in a scarlet coat with silver, not gold, lace, riding a bay gelding with a white sock on the near hind, and speaking with a slight lisp on the letter S. Both were told that the gentleman they were to intercept would be traveling alone and would be carrying upon his person a leather wallet sealed with the Oversley arms." Reginald set the coffee pot down. "The wallet was in your saddlebag, Your Grace, and is now at the bottom of the seau, since you cut the strap yourself in the flight." They knew the seal. They were told the seal. By a militia captain with a lisp. By a militia captain, we may infer, with a lisp. Reginald leaned back. His hand went, absently, to the wound in his side, and pressed once, and withdrew. "There is only one militia captain in England whom that description could fit, and who would have any interest whatever in the Oversley seal. There is only one, Your Grace. Say the name. Captain Ambrose Cust, of the Warwickshire Militia. Your late cousin's son by his second marriage, and—" Selwyn paused and coughed once into his fist, and continued as if the pause had not happened. "The same gentleman who 3 years ago, upon the reading of the late Colonel Vavasor's will, made formal application to Miss Vavasor's guardian for the hand of Miss Vavasor, and was refused." Reginald did not move for a long moment. In the window behind him the light of a Coventry noon was the color of pewter. He knew the terms of my contract with her father. He was present, Your Grace, at the reading. It was not then imagined that any harm could come of his presence. He would have known that upon my death the contract falls by Clause 7 to the nearest kinsman resident in England. He is that kinsman. He is, Your Grace. Reginald turned the coffee cup once in its saucer. He tried to kill me not for my title. He cannot inherit it. He tried to kill me for her. He has already applied to the bishop's court for a special license, entered on the morning after the ambush, in anticipation of a vacancy. Reginald was very still. Only the hand at his side moved, closing slowly into a fist upon the table, and opening again with deliberate care, as if he had reminded himself that fists were the wrong instrument. Mr. Selwyn, Your Grace, you will do the following. You will not, on any account, present yourself at the garret in Palmer Lane. You will not write to Miss Vavasour. You will not, in any office of any court, allow the name of Oversley to be spoken above a whisper for the space of 4 weeks. You will begin, quietly, to purchase every mortgage held over every friend of Captain Cust in the counties of Warwick and Northampton. You will begin, quietly, to acquire the notes of hand of Lord Barnaby Overton, which I understand may be had at £1 in the pound. You will engage a man to watch the Rose and Crown at Kenilworth, and you will, when I send for you and not before, come with the papers ready. Yes, Your Grace. Anne Selwyn. Your Grace. He must not know that I am alive, not by a whisper, not by an inference. If he believes I lie dead in a ditch outside Coventry, he will move against her openly, and when he does, I will have him in my hand. Yes, Your Grace. Selwyn tied the red tape about the papers, replaced them in the case, closed the clasps, and rose. At the door he paused. Your Grace. Yes. The lady. Is she? She is what her father said she was. Ah. Go. Selwyn went. Reginald sat a long time at the deal table over the cooling coffee. Then he rose, put on the plain drab greatcoat, went out into Broadgate, walked to the shop of a Coventry ironmonger, and bought, for 1 3d, a small pair of iron pattens with leather straps, of a size to fit a woman with a narrow foot. He carried them under his arm to the corner of Hertford Street and waited for 6 o'clock in the falling dark, and when Judith came out with her bundle of linen, he took the bundle from her without a word and handed her the pattens in exchange. The lane freezes at night, he said. You will break an ankle. She looked down at the small, dark iron shapes in her hands. Mr. Noel. Mrs. Pennington chose the size. Mr. Noel, this cannot go on. What cannot? You paying my rent, you buying my coal, you bringing my brother oranges in January and my sister engravings of a park she will never see, you standing at the corner of Hertford Street twice a day like a what, Miss Vavasour? She could not find the word. He waited, courteous, as though he had all the winter in which to hear it. Like a man with an intention, she said at last, which he refuses to name. He was quiet a moment. The lamplighter came round the corner and set the first flame into the lamp above them, and it caught in the pale of his eyes and made them, for 1 instant, silver. Miss Vavasour. Sir, I am a man who has bled upon your floor. I have no other intention toward you, at this hour, than that you should not slip upon the ice and break your ankle before you reach your own door. When I have another intention, I shall name it plainly. Until then, you will do me the courtesy of accepting 1 3d in iron, which is worth to me exactly 1 3d, and to you the whole of the next month upon your feet. She looked at him. She looked at the pattens. She looked at him again. Then she bent, in the middle of Hertford Street, and strapped the iron to her boots with her own 2 hands, in the light of the new lit lamp, and rose, and walked home with him, and did not speak again until they reached the mouth of Palmer Lane, and there she said only, "Thank you, Mr. Noel," in a voice that was not quite steady. He touched the brim of his hat and turned back toward number 9, and she stood at the foot of her own stair a long moment listening to the ring of the iron on the cobbles as his uneven step receded through the dark. Above her, in the garret, Phyllis was already at the window with her small nose against the frost. "Judith." "Yes, dearest. The soldier has come back down the lane." "Yes." "He limps worse when it is cold." "Yes." "Judith." "Yes." "Who is he, truly?" Judith stood in the doorway of the garret with the iron pattens still bright upon her boots, and the letter beneath the floorboard beating against her heel like a second heart, and the sealed contract of the Duke of Oversley whispering in green wax through the deal boards. And she did not know that 4 streets away, a grey-whiskered gentleman was buying up Lord Barnaby Overton's 7th mortgage at a shilling in the pound, and she did not know, still, whom she had saved. She only looked at her little sister and said, quite steadily, "He is a friend, Phyllis. He is our friend." And in the room above Mrs. Craik's stable, 4 doors away, the friend sat down on the edge of a narrow bed with a wound, half closed in his side, and drew from the inner pocket of the plain drab greatcoat a single copper penny, worn thin at the edges, which he had asked Mrs. Pennington that morning to procure for him, in exchange for a shilling, from a girl who did not know its provenance. And he laid the penny upon the palm of his hand, and closed his fingers over it, and did not open them again until the last of the coals in the little grate had gone dark. 3 weeks after the night of the knife, on a Tuesday of thin sunlight and thinner bread, Judith Vavasour crossed Little Park Street with a bolt of Persian lilac silk balanced upon her shoulder and a folded pattern book pressed beneath her arm, and found Arthur Noel waiting at the corner of Mrs. Pennington's shop, as he had waited every morning since the 2nd week of January, without ever having been asked. He said nothing. He never did, at that hour. He only lifted the bolt from her shoulder, with the ease of a man taking a glove from a table, transferred it to his own, and fell into step half a pace behind her, the limp in his left leg making a small syncopation against the frost-hardened cobbles. "You are late this morning," she said, without turning. "The kettle betrayed me. The kettle in your room does not exist. Mrs. Craik boasts of it, but I have looked. Then I was betrayed by a rumor of a kettle. It comes to the same thing." A smile moved across her mouth and was gone before it reached her eyes. She quickened her pace. He kept up. He always kept up, and she had ceased, some days ago, to pretend surprise at it. They came into the workroom by the back stair. Mrs. Pennington, at her cutting table, glanced up over the half-moons of her spectacles, saw the man, saw the bolt, said nothing, and returned to her chalk. She had, 3 mornings running, found the arrears of Judith's attic rent paid in full at her own counter by a hand she did not know, in shillings still cold from a pocket. She had drawn her own conclusions, and she was not a woman who spoke her conclusions aloud. Arthur laid the silk upon the deal table with a care that was almost ceremonial, touched the brim of his hat to the modiste, and withdrew. Judith watched the door close behind him. "He is very quiet, that one," Mrs. Pennington remarked to the chalk. "He is very tired," Judith said. "He does not look tired to me. He looks as though he were listening for something in the next street." Judith bent her head over the pattern book and did not answer. At noon she was sent, with a basket of pinned muslin and a hurried word from Mrs. Pennington, to the parsonage of St. Michael, where the rector's daughter was to be fitted for a morning gown. The errand kept her 40 minutes. When she came out into the churchyard, the sun had failed altogether, and the wind had turned, and Arthur was standing beside the lych gate, as though he had grown there out of the stones. "You cannot mean to walk me back," she said. "It is broad afternoon." "It is broad afternoon in Coventry," he answered, "which is a different thing from broad afternoon elsewhere." She let him take the basket. They went by the long way, past the ruined arches of the old priory, because he asked it, and because she had learned that when he asked a thing in that particular flat tone he had a reason he would not name. Halfway along the wall he stopped, set the basket down upon a broken plinth, and stood looking not at her, but at the empty lane behind them. "Miss Vavasour," he said. "Mr. Noel, you have not told me, in 3 weeks, what business it is that keeps a modiste's assistant awake at 3 in the morning writing figures in a ledger the size of a prayer book." The color left her face and then returned to it too quickly. "You have been watching my window. I have been walking under it. That is not the same thing. The candle is lit at 3. It is out by 4. There are figures. I can hear the nib." "You hear a great deal, Mr. Noel, for a man with a hole in his side. The hole is closed. My hearing is not." She looked at him, and he looked back, and for the first time since the night of the beck, she did not immediately lower her eyes. "Very well," she said. "You shall have it, and you shall have it whole, because I am tired of carrying it alone, and because you have carried baskets for me for 22 mornings without asking, and because I do not, in truth, know why I trust you, but I do." He inclined his head, once, gravely. "There is a contract," she began. "It was signed by my father 4 years before his death, at a hazard table in Bath, upon a night when he lost £12,000 and could not pay. The gentleman opposite him was persuaded to accept, in lieu, an instrument of betrothal in the person of his eldest daughter, myself, then aged 24, then still in possession of a small dowry and of the belief that a father does not sell what he cannot buy back." Arthur said nothing. "The instrument was drawn up by a solicitor called Selwyn. It was witnessed, it was sealed. It is binding at law upon my majority, which was reached 1 year ago, and it becomes actionable upon a date named in the 6th clause, which is the 1st day of April next. Do you understand me?" "I understand you." "The gentleman opposite my father, at that hazard table, was Reginald Noel, Duke of Oversley." She said the name and watched the man before her for the smallest tremor of the mouth. There was none. There was only a small tightening at the corner of one eye, which she took for the polite discomfort of a mercenary hearing the name of a peer, and which she therefore did not read. "You know of him, I suppose." "I have heard the name." "Then you have heard more than the name." "Everyone has heard more than the name. He is called, in the pamphlets, the Cold Duke. He is said to have hanged 3 of his own tenants at Oversley in the year of the corn riots, upon a gallows built within sight of their own cottages, and to have watched from the library window with a glass of claret in his hand. He is said to have refused to speak at his own mother's deathbed. He is said to have eyes of such a pale blue that servants cross themselves when he looks at them. He is said, Miss Vavasour, to have a face like the flat of a knife, and a voice like the closing of a lid, and a heart. She paused and drew breath. A heart, if he possesses one, that has never in 36 years given proof of its existence. Arthur turned his face a little away, toward the ruined arches, and appeared to examine a lichen upon the stone. "You have this, I take it, from the pamphlets." "I have it from every mouth in 3 counties. I have it from the milkwoman. I have it from the curate. I have it from a chapman who sold me a ribbon last Michaelmas and thought I ought to be warned. I have it from Mrs. Pennington, who had it from her sister in London, who had it from a laundress at Grosvenor Square. It is not a rumor, Mr. Noel. It is a climate. And you believe every word of it." "I do not require to believe it. I require only to marry it, upon the 1st of April, or to see my brother and sister sold to a workhouse for the arrears of a debt I did not incur." She lifted her chin. "You will forgive me if I do not, in the meantime, entertain nuances of character." He was silent for a long moment. Under the plain drab greatcoat, the muscles of his jaw made a small, controlled movement, once, and were still. "Nuances," he said at last, very quietly. "No, I should not expect it of you." Something in the flatness of the syllable made her look at him more closely. He met her look with a smoothness so complete that she mistook it, entirely, for indifference, and, mistaking it, she went on. "He is a monster, Mr. Noel. Do you understand? Not a bad man, not a hard man, a monster. And I am to be delivered to him in 11 weeks, by an instrument my father signed at 4 o'clock in the morning, at a table sticky with punch, and the law of England will call it a marriage." "And what," he asked, "would you have of him, if he were not a monster?" The question was so unexpected, and delivered in a tone so nearly gentle, that she stopped. "I do not understand you. If the Duke of Oversley, upon presenting himself at your door, should prove to have, I do not know, hands, and a face, and the ordinary equipment of a man, if he should prove to walk with a limp, say, from an old wound, and to have a gray hair at his temple, and to be somewhat tired about the eyes, and if he should say to you, Miss Vavasour, I did not know until 3 weeks ago that this contract existed, for it was signed in my name by a steward whom I have since dismissed, and I release you from it at once, and I beg the further indulgence of paying your father's debts, and your brother's schooling, and your sister's dowry, out of my own purse, and requiring nothing of you in return. What then?" She stared at him. "You mock me, Mr. Noel." "I do not mock you." "Then you insult me with a fable. Such a duke does not exist. Such a man does not exist. If he did, he would not be reduced to hazard tables in Bath, nor to signing girls into betrothal at 4 in the morning, nor— You have not answered the question." She was silent. Behind her, in the priory arches, a jackdaw put up a small, indignant complaint. Arthur waited. I should tell him, she said at length, that a man who buys a woman at a card table cannot afterwards pretend he has not bought her, and that his indulgence, though it may spare her flesh, cannot restore her name, that the pamphlets have already been written, that in Coventry, in Warwick, in Kenilworth, my sister is pointed at in the street as the girl whose father sold her sister to the cold duke, that his release, though generous, comes 11 weeks too late for the mothers who have crossed the road when we approach, and for the boys who have spat on my brother's boots outside the school, that I do not, in short, wish his charity, nor his purse, nor his fable, and that if he possessed any true delicacy, he would understand this without requiring me to say it. She had spoken very fast, and at the end her breath caught. She looked at Arthur and found him no longer examining the lichen. He was looking at her. His eyes, at that hour, in that light, were very nearly colorless, a pale, hard blue like the ice at the edge of a pond in February. She had never seen them so before, or she had seen them so, and had not understood what she saw. He bit, hard, upon the inside of his left cheek, and turned his head. I see, he said. Do you? I begin to. He picked up the basket from the plinth. Come, Mrs. Pennington will want her muslin, and your sister will want her supper. They walked back in silence. At the corner of Bishop Street he stopped. Miss Vavasour, I ask nothing of you. But if, upon the 1st of April, matters should stand otherwise than you now expect them, will you grant me one thing? What thing? That you will not decide, at once, that you have been made a fool of. She looked at him for a long moment. I make no promises, Mr. Noel, on the 1st of April. I am saving them for other days. He inclined his head and left her at Mrs. Pennington's door. That evening, upon the stair of the attic in Hertford Street, she found waiting for her a small man in a caped traveling cloak, with fat gray side whiskers and a leather portfolio pressed against his chest, who removed his hat as she approached and asked, in the voice of a man who has practiced the syllables for 2 hours in a carriage, whether he had the honor of addressing Miss Judith Vavasour. You have. Horace Selwyn, ma'am, solicitor. I come upon a matter of some delicacy. She let him in. Phyllis, at the fire, drew Leo behind her skirt. Mr. Selwyn declined tea, declined a chair, laid the portfolio upon the deal table, and drew from it a letter under a large red seal. You will forgive the hour, Miss Vavasour. My instructions are precise, and the road from London is not as I remember it. I am charged to deliver this into your hand, and to await your reading of it, and to answer, so far as is within my competence, such questions as may thereafter arise. She broke the seal. She read. She read it again. The paper trembled in her hand once, and she steadied it against the table. Mr. Selwyn. Ma'am. Am I to understand that the ambush in the beck behind St. Michael, upon the night of the 3rd of January, the man with the knife, the wound in the flank? I have that intelligence, ma'am, upon evidence which will not, I fear, be shaken. The gentleman who caused the wound was hired at the Cross Keys in Southam for the sum of 5 guineas, paid in a mixture of new sovereigns and old crowns, by a person who arrived on horseback at 11:30 of that same night, wearing a scarlet coat with silver lace, a peridot pin at his throat, and yellow gloves. He gave a false name. The ostler, however, remembered the horse, and the horse is stabled at Ashby House. Ashby House? The seat, ma'am, of Captain Ambrose Cust, your father's sister's son. I believe you were, some 3 years since, presented with a proposal of marriage by that gentleman. I refused him. Yes, ma'am, he has not forgotten it. She sat down, then, upon the edge of the little cot, and pressed the letter flat upon her knee. There is more, Mr. Selwyn. You have not yet come to it. There is, ma'am. Captain Cust, upon receiving intelligence 3 days ago that the intended party of the contract of April next was, indisposed, and possibly deceased in a ditch, has caused to be examined a clause in the 7th section of that contract, being the clause of substituted succession, which provides that in the event of the death or disappearance of the said party before the date of solemnization, the person of Miss Judith Vavasour shall be assigned, together with the outstanding debt, to the nearest male kinsman then in a condition to receive her. He means to take me. He means to take you, ma'am, under color of law. He has laid an affidavit before the magistrate at Warwick this morning that the that the original party is missing from his estates, has not been seen at Oversley for 11 weeks, has answered no letter, has issued no draft, and he applies, upon the strength of the affidavit and of the contract, for an order of removal upon your person, in his own protection, by 4 of the clock tomorrow afternoon. The room was very quiet. Leo had begun, softly, to cough. Phyllis was staring at her sister with the fixed, adult stare of a child who has understood a sentence not meant for her. Judith folded the letter, once, and then again. Mr. Selwyn. Ma'am? Who sent you? The solicitor hesitated. He glanced once at the window as though a face might be waiting behind it, and did not find one. I am instructed, ma'am, to say only that I am sent by a friend who has been within call of this house at all hours since the 3rd of January. A friend who thought it more prudent in the present juncture to conduct his inquiries through such a person as myself, being unknown in Coventry, than to appear in his own person, being, perhaps, better known than he should wish. A friend, ma'am. She stood and walked to the window and looked down into Hertford Street, where the lamp at the corner of Mrs. Craik's stable had been lit and was throwing a small, unsteady disk of yellow upon the frozen mud. Under the lamp, at a distance of some 4 doors, stood a man in a plain drab greatcoat, hat in hand, looking up. He did not move. She stood at the glass for a long time, and did not lift her hand, and did not lower the letter, and did not, in that moment, know whether the cold at the back of her neck was the draught from the badly seated casement, or the beginning of an understanding she had not yet permitted herself to name. Behind her, Mr. Selwyn cleared his throat. Ma'am, my instructions are that you are on no account to open the door to Captain Cust, nor to any officer accompanying him, before noon tomorrow. My instructions are further that if you will place your trust once more in the friend of whom I have spoken, matters will be so ordered by that hour as to render the captain's affidavit and his order of removal and his contract of substituted succession so much waste paper fit only for the lighting of a fire. Have I your leave to convey your answer? She did not turn from the window. Below, the man in the drab greatcoat had put on his hat, at last, and inclined his head, once, in the direction of the glass, as though he had known, all along, at what moment she would come to it. Yes, she said, very quietly, to the window, and to Mr. Selwyn, and to the small copper penny she could not yet see, clenched in a gloved hand 4 doors away. You have my leave. Tell your friend I shall not open the door. The door held for another quarter of an hour, and Judith used it as though it were a fortress. She swept the ashes from the grate. She folded Leo's shirt at the collar the way their mother had once folded it. She set the tin cup of water beside his pillow and pressed her hand to his forehead, and found the fever thin, receding, almost kind. Phyllis stood at the window, small fingers curled over the sill, watching the frost bloom and unbloom on the pane. He is still there, Phyllis whispered. Do not lean, Judith said. He has not moved once. Do not lean, my love. She did not go to the window herself. She would not give him that. Across the narrow street, 4 doors down, a shape in a dark greatcoat stood as though carved into the stones, and she had a fair idea of the shape's name, and no idea at all what it was for. She had told Mr. Selwyn she would not open the door. She had meant it. She was, at that moment, still holding to the small pride of a woman who has been offered a hand and refused it in good order. That pride survived until 10:30. The knock, when it came, was not a knock. It was a rhythm. 3 heavy blows spaced like the sentence of a magistrate. The stair beneath the door groaned. She heard boots on the boards below and a woman crying out, and Mrs. Pennington's voice sharp as a needle, and then a second voice, warm, courteous, ruinous. Madam, I am here on behalf of the family. Do stand aside. Judith set Leo's shirt on the chair. She smoothed her apron with hands that did not shake because she would not let them. She crossed to the door and lifted the latch herself. Captain Ambrose Cust removed his shako as though the room deserved it. The peridot pin at his throat caught the low lamp. Behind him, 2 officers in the scarlet of the militia filled the landing, and behind them, 1 step lower, a stout man in a rust-brown coat, with a leather satchel, and the small, tired face of a bailiff on a cold morning. Cust smiled at her, as a cousin smiles at a cousin. The scar at his jaw was still pink at the edges. "Judith," he said. "My dear, you must forgive the hour." "I do not," she said. "Ah!" The smile did not falter. It was, she noted with a distant and useful clarity, a precise, elegant lie. "Then you must at least hear me. May we come in?" "You are in." Phyllis had gone very still at the window. Leo turned his face to the wall and coughed once into the pillow. A small, polite sound, as though even sickness understood not to be seen just now. The bailiff cleared his throat and looked at the boards. Cust stepped past her, unhurried, and set his shako on the deal table beside the mended fawn bonnet, as if the two objects had always belonged to one household. He drew off his yellow gloves finger by finger. "Cousin," he said, "I have grave news, and I would spare you it if I could. His Grace the Duke of Oversley has been missing these 3 weeks. There is reason to fear the worst. The estate is presently in confusion. Certain instruments," he inclined his head toward the mahogany box on the mantel, "require, in the interim, the guardianship of a nearer relation. You are not my relation. I am your father's sister's son. The parish register will bear me out." "The parish register will bear a great many things. It will not bear you into this room." He laughed. It was not unkind, which was worse. He turned to the bailiff and lifted one finger, and the bailiff cleared his throat again and drew a folded paper from the satchel. "Miss Vavasour," the bailiff said, not quite meeting her eyes, "there is a distress here for £11 14 and 6 on the person of one Marcus Vavasour, Esquire, deceased. There is a further distress of £4 on this present tenancy in arrears. There is a warrant of guardianship over the minors Phyllis and Leo Vavasour, sworn this morning before the magistrate at Warwick, and there is a clause," his eyes flicked at last to Cust, who nodded gently, "there is a clause in a certain private contract of settlement, which, in the event of the incapacity or absence of the principal, devolves the person of Miss Judith Vavasour into the protection of the nearest male kin, which, sir, in this case is the captain." "Read it," Judith said. "Ma'am, I have—" "Read the clause." The bailiff read the clause. It was 3 lines. It was very well drawn. It used the word protection twice and the word person once, and Cust watched her face while it was read with an interest that would, in a court of any decency, have hanged him. "You will observe," he said mildly, when the bailiff had folded the paper again, "that I have not come to seize you. I have come to offer, in the face of misfortune, the shelter of my own house at Kenilworth. My mother is there. Miss Phyllis and Master Leo will be entered at once at a school in Rugby which I have already engaged. The debts on this room will be discharged from my own purse before we leave the street. This," he gestured, almost apologetic, at the mahogany box, "must accompany us, as it forms part of the settlement papers now under my keeping. You will not touch that box. Judith, you will not touch that box." He nodded, as though she had said something reasonable, and lifted the box in both hands. It was so light. She had always thought it was so light. He tucked it under his arm and turned to the bailiff. "Have the goodness to record that the box was surrendered without violence." "Sir," said the bailiff, and wrote nothing. Phyllis made a small sound at the window, a sound she had not made since their mother's funeral, and Judith crossed the room in 3 strides and took her by the shoulder and said, close to her ear, "Not a word, not one." Phyllis nodded. Leo did not turn from the wall. "You cannot take the children," Judith said. "The warrant takes the children. I merely accompany the warrant. They are ill. They will be warm within the hour. Cousin, do please believe me. I have no wish to distress you. On the contrary." He set the box on the table and stepped, very lightly, into the small space between her and the fire. "It has grieved me these many months to see you in this reduced condition. If you will only allow me the office of a kinsman, this misery ends today. And the contract is honored, as the Duke intended, merely, with a different party." She looked at him. She saw, quite plainly, the boy who at 9 had put a live sparrow in her sewing basket to see her cry, and had smiled the same smile when she opened it. She saw the man who had, 3 weeks ago, put a knife into a stranger's flank in an alley behind St. Michael's and left him for the snow. She saw the peridot pin winking at his throat with the pulse of a healthy heart. "Get out of my room," she said. "After you, cousin." He offered his arm. There is a moment, in certain small histories, when a woman understands that the law has been drawn against her while she was mending stockings, and that no argument in the room will unmake it. Judith understood the moment. She did not argue. She turned to Phyllis and buttoned the child's little coat under the chin, and she wrapped Leo in the blanket from the pallet and lifted him with the ease of a woman who has been lifting him for a year, and she took her fawn bonnet off the peg and tied it under her jaw with hands that were, at last, allowed to be a little unsteady, because no one was looking at her hands but God. The officers went down first. Cust followed with the mahogany box. The bailiff went behind Judith with his satchel and his tired face, and did not offer to carry the child, which she preferred. On the stair, Mrs. Pennington waited with her lace cap askew, and her tesourina of silver clenched in her fist like a weapon of a size she could actually manage. "Judith," she said, "Judith Vavasour, you tell me now whether I am to fetch the constable or whether I am to hold my peace." "Hold your peace, ma'am, he is the constable." "He is not. He has brought one. It is the same thing this morning." Mrs. Pennington's mouth worked. She reached out and touched Leo's foot through the blanket, and then she pressed a small warm parcel into Judith's free hand, bread, still hot from her own hearth, and stepped back against the wall as though standing back required all her strength. The street had gathered. Of course the street had gathered. It always did, for a Vavasour. Word ran ahead of boots in Coventry. Windows lifted. Aprons appeared at doorways. The peaman 2 doors down set down his tray. Even the sweeps boy stood in the gutter with his brush across his shoulder like a soldier's musket. Snow had begun again, small and dry, the kind that does not melt on the shoulder but sits. Cust paused on the top step and turned to the street with the grace of a man taking a curtain call. He raised his voice. Not much, only enough. "Good people of Bishop Street, you will have heard the sad rumor. His Grace the Duke of Oversley is these 3 weeks unaccounted for on the northern road, and grave fears are entertained for his person. In this hour of confusion, I have taken upon myself, as the nearest male kin, the guardianship of Miss Vavasour and her family. The debts upon this house," he lifted one gloved hand in the direction of the landlord, who happened, most conveniently, to be already among the crowd, "will be discharged before I leave the street. There is no scandal here. There is only a family, and a duty, and the mercy of Christian kin." There was a small, ugly cheer from the landlord's side of the crowd. Judith watched a woman she had mended a shawl for last Tuesday cross herself and look away. Then, from the corner by the chandler's, a laugh. A round, wet, well-fed laugh. Lord Barnaby Overton had been to breakfast somewhere and was not sober. His green coat strained across his belly. His whiskers held a fleck of egg. He came forward on unsteady boots with his beaver hat in his hand and pointed at Judith with the hat. "Ha, there she is. There's the Vavasour minx. Duke's fancy, they said, hey? Duke's private paper, hey? And now she's the captain's charity, is she? By God, Cust, you've a stomach on you. I would not take the second course at that table." Cust did not turn. He merely smiled at the middle distance. "Overton," he said pleasantly, "you have breakfasted." "I have, handsomely. And I say what all the street says. Old Vavasour drank his acres, and his daughter sells the leavings. First a duke, now a captain. What next, my girl? A tinker?" Someone shushed him. Someone else laughed. Judith felt Phyllis's shoulder go rigid under her hand, and she pressed down, once, firm, steady. Leo, mercifully, had shut his eyes against her collar and did not lift them. She looked at Overton. She did not answer him. She lifted her chin exactly the depth of 1 inch, and she looked past his shoulder, across the street, 4 doors down. He was there. He had not moved. The dark greatcoat, the low hat, the shape of a shoulder she had bandaged with her own hands on her knees in the snow. Arthur. Arthur, who had carried her baskets and paid her arrears through Mrs. Pennington and made her laugh at her own fear of the monster Duke. Arthur, who had, 3 nights ago, sat at her table and eaten her bread and said, quiet as anything, that no one would take her while he lived. He was standing quite still. His hands were in his pockets. He was watching. He was doing nothing. For one breath she believed she had misread the whole street. For the next breath she believed the fault was hers, that she had confused a mercenary's kindness with a mercenary's promise, that she had, in the exhaustion of the year, built a house of feeling on a foundation of nothing. For the third breath she believed the older and simpler thing, the thing her father had drunk himself into the grave to deny, that no one comes. Then a small copper glint moved at the edge of his glove. He had taken something from his pocket. He turned it once in his fingers. A penny. Her penny. The last coin she had ever owned in her life, polished now to a warm red. She saw it. He wished her to see it. That was all he offered, in front of the street, in front of Cust, in front of the officers, and the bailiff, and Lord Barnaby Overton, and God. A coin turned once in the light. She did not understand it. She could not, at that hour, afford to understand it. What she understood was that he was not crossing the street. Something in her chest, which had been a small, orderly, useful thing for many years, folded neatly in on itself and lay down. "Cousin," Cust said gently at her elbow, "the carriage." She turned her head. She looked at him with an expression which, later, he would describe to his mother as tolerably calm. "Captain Cust," she said, quite clearly, so that the pieman and the landlord and Mrs. Pennington and Lord Barnaby Overton and the man across the street with a penny in his glove could all hear her. "You may take me into your carriage. You may take the box. You will not take my sister and my brother into any school in Rugby or in any other town. They will remain with Mrs. Pennington in this house until I write for them, and you will pay her their keep out of the sum you propose to spend upon my ruin, and you will do it now, before we leave this step, in coin, into her hand." Cust's smile did not move. His eyes did. "Cousin, the warrant. The warrant names their guardian. It does not name their residence. Read it again. I have listened better than you supposed." The bailiff, behind her, made a small sound which might, in a fair man, have been the beginning of a laugh. Mrs. Pennington's fist tightened on the tesorina. Cust looked once at the crowd, once at Overton, once, very briefly, across the street at nothing in particular, and then he inclined his head. "As you wish, cousin, their keep, 6 months in advance, Mrs. Pennington, if you please." He counted the sovereigns into the modista's palm with the neat cruelty of a man who has, at least, been made to count. 12 pieces of gold. It was more money than had passed through the Vavasor name in 3 years. Judith set Leo down on the top step and knelt and kissed his forehead. He did not open his eyes. She turned to Phyllis and cupped the small pointed chin in her palm and said, "Lo, you will mind Mrs. Pennington. You will not write to me. If a letter comes to you in my hand, you will burn it without reading. Do you understand me? Judy, do you understand me?" "Yes." "Good girl." She stood. She smoothed her apron. She did not look across the street. She walked down the 4 snowy steps between the officers and stopped at the door of the plain black chaise Cust had brought, and she paused with one gloved hand on the frame and turned, at last, and looked. He was gone. The doorway 4 doors down was empty. The snow on the step where he had stood was already blurring. There was no coin, no shoulder, no shape of a man who had once said, quite low across a bowl of thin soup, that no one would take her while he lived. She got into the carriage. She sat with her hands folded on the top of the mahogany box that Cust set carefully upon her lap, as though restoring to her something she had lent him. The door shut, the bolt slid, the horses moved. Through the small oval window she saw Mrs. Pennington fold Phyllis against her bombazine skirts. She saw Lord Barnaby Overton lift his hat in a mockery of salute. She saw the empty doorway 4 doors down, and the empty step, and the empty street, and, above it, one flake of snow going the wrong way in a small private wind. Inside the carriage, Cust unfolded a lap rug and settled it across her knees with the courtesy of a bridegroom. He tapped the roof with his cane. He looked at her, and his eyes were doing at last what his mouth had been forbidden to do all morning. "There now," he said softly. "That was not so difficult, was it, cousin?" She did not answer him. She looked at the mahogany box on her lap, and she thought, with a clarity so cold it felt almost like warmth, of the small brass key sewn into the hem of her petticoat, and of the letter beneath the false bottom of the box which named, in her father's hand, the true executor of the Vavasor estate. She thought of Phyllis buttoned under the chin. She thought of Leo's forehead cooling under her palm. She thought of a copper penny turned once in a glove and then gone. She had believed, an hour ago, that she was a woman who had been left. She saw now that she was a woman who had been placed. Which of the two was the truth, she would find out in Kenilworth, or she would not find it out at all. The chaise turned the corner at the Chandlers'. Coventry closed behind her like a book. And 4 doors down from an empty room in Bishop Street, in a doorway where a man had stood for 2 hours without moving, The snow filled in the last shape of a boot, and covered over, as snow covers everything, the small red gleam of a coin dropped, on purpose, exactly there. The chaise did not stop for 9 hours. It changed horses twice, at coaching inns where Mr. Selwyn's man leaned from the box and spoke a single word to the ostler, and the ostler bowed as if a bell had rung inside his ribs. Judith did not sleep. She held Leo against her shoulder while he coughed into her collar, and she counted, out of an old habit, the small square of Phyllis's hand inside her own. Phyllis had not asked one question since Bishop Street. She only watched the window and the flakes going backwards past the glass, and once, softly, she said, "The seat is warm underneath." "It is a hot brick," Judith said, "under the leather. I have never sat above a fire before." Judith kissed the top of her head and did not answer. They came into a park at first light. The chaise slowed to a walk under an avenue of leafless limes, and beyond the limes a house appeared that had no end. Judith had seen prints of it once, folded into a broadsheet, above a paragraph about a wedding. She had not, then, believed the print. The chaise stopped at a portico of 6 white columns. 2 footmen in dark green livery opened the door as if the door had asked them. She stepped down in the fawn wool with the wrong-colored mend at the shoulder and the pattens she had put on in the snow, and she carried Leo on her hip because he would not be put down. At the top of the steps stood a very small, very upright old woman in mazarine blue silk under a black overgown, a white plume in her turban, 3 ropes of pearls at her throat. Her eyes were the color of a January sky, and Judith knew the color before she knew the woman. "Miss Vavasour," said Lady Cornelia Noel, Dowager Duchess of Oversley, "you will forgive the hour. My nephew is not at present permitted to greet you himself. Come inside, the children are cold." She did not offer her hand. She turned and walked, and Judith followed because there was nothing else in the world to do. The hall was marble. The marble was warm. A fire the size of a cart shed burned at the far end, and a woman in a black gown was already unwrapping Leo's shawl with the practiced speed of somebody who had unwrapped many small brothers. Phyllis's fingers tightened once inside Judith's and released. "Miss Phyllis will take chocolate in the small parlor," Lady Cornelia said, without turning. "Master Leo, the physician. Miss Vavasour, with me." "They stay with me," Judith said. Lady Cornelia stopped. She looked back over her shoulder, and the plume dipped once. "They stay in this house," she said, "which is a slightly larger arrangement. The physician has been waiting since 4. Your brother's cough is not, I think, an argument you wish to win." Judith let Leo go. He went to the woman in black without protest, and Phyllis followed the chocolate, and Judith heard, as she climbed the great staircase behind the dowager, the first genuine laugh her sister had produced since summer. At the top of the staircase, Lady Cornelia turned right and opened a door. It was a lady's dressing room. A fire was lit. On a stand of polished mahogany hung a gown of imperial purple silk, so deep the folds of it looked almost black, sewn over with a crepe of silver thread that caught the firelight and threw it back in points. Beside it, on a smaller stand, a pair of long white gloves. On a dressing table, a case of dark blue velvet stood open. Amethysts and diamonds slept inside it, tier upon tier, like a very quiet church. Judith did not step forward. "I cannot wear that," she said. "No," Lady Cornelia agreed. "Not yet. You will wear it tomorrow. Today, you will wear what you came in." Judith looked at her. "There is a room downstairs," Lady Cornelia said, "in which a number of people are about to be undone. My nephew wishes you to be in it. He wishes you to be in it exactly as you came out of Bishop Street. He was very particular about the shoulder." She reached out and, with one gloved finger, touched the wrong-colored thread at Judith's shoulder without looking at it. "He said," she added, "that the room should see what it had refused to see." Then she opened the door again and led her back down. The room they entered was long and paneled and full. Judith had time to notice the fire and the length of the table, and then she noticed the people, and after that she noticed nothing for a full breath. Captain Ambrose Cust stood at the far end in his scarlet militia coat with the silver galloons, one hand on the back of a chair. His mouth had prepared a smile and forgotten to finish it. Beside him, Lord Barnaby Overton was already the color of his own waistcoat. 2 other men Judith did not know were seated with papers in front of them, and behind them stood 4 lifeguards in scarlet, with drawn sabers held at the rest. At the head of the table stood Mr. Horace Selwyn, with his brown leather case open and a single sheet of vellum in his hand. And beside the fire, in a coat of scarlet so much finer than Cust's that Cust's looked, suddenly, like a costume, stood the man she had known as Arthur. The blue sash of the Order of the Bath crossed his chest. Gold aiguillettes hung from his shoulder. His hair was combed back. He had no stick. His weight was on the good leg in a way she recognized now as a decision. His eyes did not move from her face. She did not curtsy. She did not move. She heard, distinctly, Leo's cough 2 rooms away, and it was that sound, small and familiar, that unlocked her breath. "Miss Vavasour," said Mr. Selwyn, gently, without turning, "if you will stand there, please. You need do nothing. His Grace has asked that no address be required of you." She stood where she was. Mr. Selwyn turned back to the room. "Captain Cust," he said, "the document you produced in Bishop Street 2 nights ago, in the presence of a constable, purporting to be a codicil to the marriage articles between His Grace of Oversley and Miss Judith Vavasour, has been examined by Sir Rowland Bicknell of Doctors' Commons. The seal is genuine, the signature is not, the hand is your own, disguised. Sir Rowland will swear to it." Cust opened his mouth. Mr. Selwyn did not stop. "On the 11th of January, in the lane behind St. Michael's, you engaged 3 men out of Birmingham to take His Grace's life. One of them is at present in Warwick Gaol, and has made a full statement. The knife recovered from His Grace's flank bears the mark of a Birmingham cutler who has identified you as the purchaser. His Grace is prepared to prosecute you before your peers. The warrant is drawn." He laid the vellum on the table. "You will go from this room," he said, "in the custody of these gentlemen, to the Tower, to await trial in the House of Lords." Cust's hand left the chair back. 2 lifeguards were already at his elbows. He looked, for one instant, past Selwyn, past the Duke, at Judith. Whatever he had prepared to say did not come. He was walked out. The door closed behind him with the sound of a small, final book. Lord Barnaby Overton was still standing. He had not been asked to. "My lord," Mr. Selwyn said, "your mortgages, all of them, on Fenny Compton, on the Coventry houses, on the Warwick shares, bought last night by a gentleman acting on His Grace's instruction. They fall due in 30 days. His Grace does not propose to renew." Lord Barnaby made a sound that was meant to be a word, and was not. "You laughed in a public street," Mr. Selwyn said, without heat, "at a young woman on the day her brother was taken from her. His Grace remembers it. 30 days, my lord." Lord Barnaby was walked out by no one. He walked himself. The door closed again. Mr. Selwyn drew from his case a canvas bag, heavy, and set it on the marble side table with a sound Judith had not heard in 7 years. The settled, dull chink of gold that was not counted because it did not need to be. "Miss Vavasour," he said, "the Vavasour debts, every one, every ledger in Coventry, and every ledger in London, paid this morning at 8, in coin, by my clerks. The receipts are in this case. Your father's name is clear." She did not touch the bag. She was looking at the man by the fire. He had not moved. Now he did. He came across the room, quietly, with the small limp she had washed and stitched in the snow, and he stopped 6 feet from her, which was farther than she had ever been from him since the night of the knife. "Judith," he said. Her name in his mouth was the same as it had been in the alley. That was what undid her, in the end. Not the scarlet coat, not the sash, not the sabers, not the gold on the table. The way he said her name. "You watched," she said, "in Bishop Street. You stood in the doorway. I saw your boots. You did not come." "I did not come," he said, "because if I had come as Arthur, they would have killed him in the yard, and if I had come as Oversley, I would have shot Cust on your stairs in front of your brother. Selwyn asked me for one night. He needed the Birmingham man to speak, and the mortgages to close at the change, and Sir Rowland to see the seal. I gave him the night. It was the longest night of my life. You let them take Leo. For 4 hours. Selwyn's man was in the next room from the moment they crossed the threshold. Your brother slept on his knee. He was returned to your door by 6. I know because I carried him up the stair myself, in the dark, and I put him in the bed you sleep in, and I stood in your room for a count of 100 before I left, because I did not trust my hand not to write your name on the plaster." She could not speak. He went, then down onto the good knee, and, because the other would not fold, kept it out to the side in a way that ought to have looked awkward and did not, because a Duke of Oversley, kneeling in his own hall in the uniform of the Life Guards, is not, whatever else, awkward. He took, from the inner pocket of the scarlet coat, a copper penny, worn smooth, polished until the head of the young king shone like a small warm sun. He held it up to her on the flat of his palm. "This is yours," he said. "You gave it in the snow for bandages and brandy and soup, and you kept nothing for yourself. It has been in my pocket since the morning I could stand. I have carried it into 3 rooms in which I was afraid, and it has not once failed me." He turned his hand over and let the penny lie in hers. "The rest," he said, "is also yours, if you will have me. The house, the name, the chair by the fire, the place in the Lords for your brother's schooling. I will not ask twice, because you have already been asked once too often by a man who did not mean it. I mean it. Say no, and Selwyn will settle 2,000 a year on you and your sister and your brother by deed of gift before dark, without condition, and you will never see me again unless you send. Say yes, and you will not, from this hour, carry anything you did not choose to carry." She looked at the coin in her palm. It was warm from his pocket. It was the same coin. There was the same small nick on the rim where she had bitten it, once, at 14, to prove to Phyllis it was real. "Arthur," she said. His mouth moved. "Reginald," he said. "But Arthur, still, when you like." "Stand up," she said. "The knee." "I will stand," he said, "when you have answered." She closed her fingers over the penny. She could feel, through the copper, the beat of him at the wrist. "Yes," she said. He stood, then. He did it slowly, because the knee did not forgive haste, and she put her hand under his elbow without thinking, and he let her, and Lady Cornelia, at the door, turned her face very deliberately towards a portrait she had seen every day for 40 years. The ball was the next night. It was not, by the custom of the county, a wedding ball. The wedding had been that morning, in the chapel of the palace, before the Bishop of Worcester, with Phyllis carrying the ring on a cushion of white satin, because Leo had been forbidden to run, and had been permitted to hold the prayer book instead, which he did with both hands, and the gravity of a small cabinet minister. Judith wore the fawn wool for the chapel, she had asked. Reginald had bowed his head once and said, "As you wish," and the dowager, who had views, had not, on this occasion, expressed them. For the ball, she wore the imperial purple. The silk was so dark that when she moved it seemed at first to be black, and then, as the candles caught the silver crepe, it was suddenly and startlingly the color of a bishop's ring. The amethysts lay at her throat and in her ears and along the front of her hair. Her gloves went to the elbow. Phyllis, in white muslin with a violet sash, held her hand at the top of the stairs and said, "You look like the inside of a stained window," which was the finest compliment Judith had ever been paid, and would remain so. Reginald waited at the foot of the stairs in the scarlet coat and the blue sash. He was not, she noted, carrying the stick. He would pay for it tomorrow, and neither of them would speak of it. The master of ceremonies called the first dance. It was a waltz, which was, in the county in that year, still faintly scandalous, and had been chosen, Judith understood, on purpose. He offered his hand. She took it. He said, quietly, as they moved to the center of the floor, "The knee will not do a quick turn. You will have to lead in the small figures." "I know," she said. "I have been leading small figures since I was 12. He laughed, once, low, and the room, which had never heard the Duke of Oversley laugh in public, went perfectly still for the length of a breath, and then, with excellent manners, pretended it had not. The music began. He held her at the waist, with the hand that had once been a fist in the snow. She rested her gloved fingers on the gold at his shoulder. His limp in a slow waltz was not a limp, it was a hesitation on the third beat of every bar, and she found, as they turned, that if she waited for it, if she let her own weight settle into the third beat and go, the hesitation was not a fault at all. It was the shape of the dance. They turned once under the great chandelier. Phyllis, on a chair by the wall, held Leo on her lap, and both of them watched with their mouths a little open. Lady Cornelia beside them watched the room instead, and marked with the small precise cruelty of a dowager exactly which faces had, 6 months ago, refused a card and exactly which of those faces were, tonight, smiling. At the far end of the ballroom, above the fireplace, hung the Vavasour arms, freshly quartered with the arms of Oversley. Mr. Selwyn had had them painted overnight. He was, at that moment, standing under them with a glass of claret he was not drinking, watching his employer waltz, and permitting himself, for the first time in 40 years of service, an expression that on any other face would have been called joy. Reginald bent his head a little. His mouth was near her ear. "You have not said it, yet today," he murmured, "that I am the monster of the county." "You are not," she said. "I was misinformed." "By whom?" "By everyone." "And now?" She looked up at him. The candles were behind him. She could not for a moment see the blue of his eyes at all, only the shape of him against the light, the exact shape she had first seen kneeling in the snow with a knife in his side, and no name. "Now," she said, "I have been seen, and so have you. It is the same thing in the end." He did not answer. He did not need to. He turned her, gently, into the third beat, and the third beat held her, as it would hold her every night for the rest of a long and quiet life. And somewhere in a locked drawer of a writing desk in a room she had not yet been shown, a copper penny with a bitten rim lay on a folded scrap of fawn wool, with a wrong-colored mend, waiting, as such small things wait, to be handed, one day, to a daughter who would ask what it was for. She had given her last coin, on a January night, to a stranger in the snow. She had, without knowing it, been the only one who ever truly saw him, and he, in the end, had been the only one who ever truly saw her, and everything else in the world, the scarlet and the silk, the marble and the gold, the ruined cousin and the cleared name, and the warm brick under a child's feet in a chaise, was only what happens when two people, at last, are seen. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever given your last coin to someone who could offer nothing in return, and wondered later what that small mercy set in motion? Have you ever been judged by a mended dress or an unpaid rent, when the truest measure of you was carried in silence beneath a floorboard, and when the world finally saw you, as Judith was seen upon that marble staircase, did you have the courage to accept what was offered, not out of gratitude, but out of choice? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, justice, and love that arrives against all odds, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click Join to become a part of our community and help the channel.